and welcome to the COVID Advocacy Exchange. I'm Dave Fuhrer with Grit. We're honored to have you with us, whether this is your first time joining or you've been with us for all three of the preceding episodes. I thought today I would start with a confession. Normally, anytime that I get to share a few remarks, I spend a lot of time practicing to make sure that in the few brief moments that we have together, my comments are always really meaningful. And we always care so much about the remarks that we make. And I'm going to admit to you today that I didn't spend any time preparing the remarks that I normally do, because I want today to be about being present, not about trying to be perfect. And as all of our isolation stretches on and the challenges that we face have not gone away yet, I want to make sure that this gathering is meaningful for you and for everybody that's here with us today. And so I'd like to start, if I may, by asking how you're doing. And if I can invite you to share one word in the chat at the bottom of your screen. If you click on it, it will open. And just share with us one word that describes how you are today. I'll give everyone just a moment. Okay, thank you. This panel today is tired. That's a very honest emotion. This panel today is of real importance to me personally. All of these topics have been built, these sessions each week, from feedback from you, the advocacy partners involved in this exchange. And this topic around interruptions to clinical trials and how we safely return and what it means, for me, goes all the way back to the origins of why I became an advocate in 2012. And so I wanted to share that with you for a moment. Even as a healthcare researcher, which is what I was in 2012, when my own father was diagnosed with a disease, we didn't know how to find new treatment options or anything about the clinical trial landscape. And I felt really frustrated as inadequate. I felt really overwhelmed that it was such a challenging environment to try to find options and hope for my own father, even though I was a researcher and a two-time cancer survivor myself. And that moment in life, that overwhelmed, is why I became an advocate in 2012. These individuals, the panelists that are with us today, are not only experts, they have not only dedicated their lives to the development of new therapies, but they are also some of the most human and remarkable people I have ever met. And so as we have this conversation today, I encourage you to be human with us. Share your comments, let us know what you're dealing with. In the comments that we've had over the last several weeks, advocates have been everywhere on the spectrum, from individuals who are as expert as our panelists today to individuals that know very little or are just joining advocacy. And wherever you are on that spectrum, today is for you. Today is for us. And today is to figure this out together. In just a moment, I will introduce Kate Owen, who I've been told I don't need to say Catherine unless it's coming from her mom. So I will let Kate introduce herself and our panelists in just a moment. I'm going to come back on towards the end of the session, and I'll be really excited to share with you then the rest of this virtual conference, all of the exhibitor areas that the advocate partners have created and provided content for people around the world. We invite you to share this. If you want to send this link to anybody to join us today or at any time in the future, all of these sessions are recorded and they're available 24/7. You can simply click on the same link you did to join this, and all of the previous sessions, as well as the exhibitor area and all of the resources are available for you or for anybody anytime. I'll also have some additional remarks in the closing about where we go from here. And specifically, we've built this whole program as a patient-created and patient-led initiative. So we'll wrap up today by asking you the things you're dealing with and what's most important for us to address in future sessions. Okay. I think I've been present a little longer than I'm comfortable, and so I am ready to turn it over to our moderator. I am thrilled for this conversation we are about to have together, and I encourage you to be present, to share your comments throughout, and to really dig in and lean into this topic together. With that, Kate, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think if I was to use one word, it would be excited and nervous as I begin to do this. This is my first session hosting a panel of experts in a remote setting. Now, I can be a bit of a chatter, so we might have to alleviate the conversation, and I'm hoping you're going to alleviate me of that by bringing in your questions and driving this forward. Now, I always think that clinical trials offer the opportunity of hope and care. But I always say that they weave a little bit of magic. And by that, what do I mean? I mean that we in clinical trials set up a study, and we hope that the right patient walks through the right clinic door at exactly the right moment in time, in the right frame of mind, having the right conversation with a healthcare provider, and then making a decision that turns out to be the right one for them and their families. Coming from a company like BMS, I realize I control none of that. I just facilitate it with a wonderful group of individuals around the world. But we have to learn and we have to adapt. And COVID has brought me many, many learnings and adaptations. And I'm hopeful that as we have this discussion this afternoon, that you help me learn more, adapt more, and potentially offer me your expertise and what's important on your minds as we return to clinical trials, as they are very much needed. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce or ask my panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Amy, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Amy Moore, Director of Science and Research at the GO2 Foundation for Lung Cancer. And my background is I'm trained as a virologist. That's what my PhD is in, which is very timely right now in the midst of this ongoing pandemic. But then I had moved into cancer research as a postdoc, and then have spent over now 12 years in the nonprofit advocacy space, building research infrastructure, and now working in the patient advocacy space, supporting lung cancer in particular. So I am honored to be here and look forward to the conversation.
So do I. And next I'm going to turn it to Kathy Griffin.
Sorry, unmuting. And Kate, I'll go back and say only my father calls me Kathy. So I'll call you Catherine if you call me Kathy, okay? So thanks for having me. I'm an executive director at Syneos Health. We're a contract research and contract commercial organization. We work in all different indications and we work globally. My job and role really is to work with my business partners and with the sponsor organizations to help identify, evaluate, and pilot new technologies and data sources that help us keep business running. So right now I'm spending a lot of time looking for solutions like telemedicine and e-consent and e-diaries for patients so that the work of developing a drug can continue regardless of where the patient sits when they can't walk through that clinic door at the right time and be in the right space, but they can do it in their home in the real world, which is probably where we should be thinking about doing more research anyway, because it reflects real life and real conditions. I'm very honored to participate today and I'm gonna really be excited about all the questions that come through.
So am I. And with that, I'm gonna turn to Upal Basel-Roy to introduce himself.
Thank you, Kate. So my name is Dr. Upal Basel-Roy, and I am the Vice President of Research at Longevity Foundation. And I trained actually as a translational cancer researcher, and then I did my postdoc in public health. And I think it's, again, one of those really, really interesting situations right now as a lung cancer patient advocate, wearing both my translational cancer research hat as well as my public health scientist research hat. And at Longevity Foundation, we are extremely passionate about access to clinical trials, because we see clinical trials not just as clinical research, but as a mechanism of access to life-saving therapies. And I think this discussion is incredibly timely for us to sort of rethink and reimagine the clinical trial paradigm. And I'm incredibly honored and delighted to be a part of this panel. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. And then I believe Dr. Farris is about to join us, and he will be our fourth panelist.
Hi, my name is Dr. Chris Farris, and I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I work with Tryon Medical Partners. My training and background is that of a MD, and my PhD training is in neuroscience. And then I became a gastroenterologist. Right now, I'm a clinical gastroenterologist doing clinical work and clinical research with Tryon Medical Partners. We've relatively newly established a large multi-specialty group here in Charlotte, about 2 years old now, although the group of doctors has been together since 1936. But we've become independent, and as part of that, we've set up clinical research programs that are really just about to blossom when COVID-19 hit. So not only our clinical practice, but our research efforts have been significantly impacted this spring and early summer. And so I'm very, very honored and happy to be here today to discuss these issues, and hope to learn a lot from all of you. So thanks for having me.
Thank you all really very much for joining us. Now, I am hoping that we get lots of questions from the audience that are paying attention to us today. But while they gear up and begin to think about a question that they might want the panel to answer, I'm going to ask the first one. And from my perspective, it really comes to, and perhaps Dr. Farris, this is for you. What do you think are is most foremost in the patient's minds or the caregiver's minds as they consider clinical trial options, especially in light of us being in the midst of COVID-19?
Oh, okay, there I am. So that's a great question, and it comes up in all, not just the area of clinical research and trials, but just in the area of life in general for people. I think that in most of my interactions, people aren't so much concerned about themselves, but the concept that family members, friends, and people that they will come in contact with after their interactions, whatever they may be, on behalf of themselves, so that they're concerned about bringing it to others. And of course, we all know people who are of a certain age or of certain comorbidities that would be at high risk if they were to become infected. And I think about one experience that a company here in Charlotte had, a assisted living type facility, where apparently an employee may have brought inadvertently a virus to work and caused people to get sick. Maybe it was an asymptomatic spread situation, but in any case, that just dramatically affects people when that happens, and the sort of survivor's guilt that people feel is tremendous. So in my experience, it's not so much that people are concerned about themselves in every case, but also concerned about family members and friends, and how we control impact on others as we work through doing these kinds of studies safely.
And maybe Amy, you might want to provide some context here as well.
Yeah, Upal and I are friends and colleagues really representing the lung cancer community. And I think this is a very real concern of theirs right now, because the data is showing us that lung cancer patients are more likely to have a more severe form of the disease and have higher rates of mortality. And so there's concern about ongoing access to clinical trials, to treatment for their disease. Is it safe to continue to do so? There's concerns about the impacts on clinical trials going forward, and halting of research, if you will. And all those things are paramount in the lung cancer community, that we maintain that momentum that is and has, extended and improved and is saving lives. We've made so much progress in the lung cancer space recently, and patients want to know, are we going to be able to keep that going? And for me personally, how can I continue to get my life-saving treatment?
And on that note, I think that leads us to a sort of secondary question, and probably to Kathleen. What innovations, what adaptations to clinical trials have sort of resulted as this crucible moment, and the industry and all of us trying to pivot to be more flexible. I'd welcome your thoughts on that type of segment of what we're trying to do here.
Sure, it's a really interesting environment right now. All the pharmaceutical companies and researchers were beginning to stick their toes in the water, to use technologies that enable us to capture the data that's required to prove the efficacy, safety, et cetera, of a drug, which has been done historically in a very manual way, right? We have applied technologies, but it's a little bit dated, a lot cumbersome in some cases. And everybody's wondering, can we really do this in a different way? You guys all know the pharma industry is slow to change. They're cautious. They want to be certain. But COVID has forced them to say, okay, well, we've been trying, we've done a test here and there, we've used telemedicine a little bit. We're trying to get people to sign up and enroll and consent online. It can be challenging, but we don't have any choice anymore. We're going to have to do that very quickly and right now and adopt those technologies. So I think telemedicine is a perfect example, which is fairly common in care delivery right now, but not in clinical research. But you can't send rare disease patients to a physician office right now, especially in many of the European and Asian countries.
Yes.
So there was no choice but to figure out how to do that. Some of the symptoms discussions could happen on the phone, but many you need to see the patient. The patient needs to see the physician. You need some sort of personal interaction. So that's what we initially started deploying very, very quickly. Fortunately, there are providers and partners out there that can do that, and it's pretty amazing how quickly. I will tell you two things. We were asked to do this on 4 different studies within a certain pharmaceutical company. They said, we're going to take it off, when we are through this crisis. So it's got to be easy and quick. Within about 3 weeks, they had already said, this is working so well, we're not going to take it off. This has got to be the way we move this trial forward and keep that interaction with the patient stronger in some respects because it's easier and more comfortable. You just have to think about things like the privacy, et cetera.
Exactly.
And one other really quick but fascinating statistic, University of Massachusetts, Mass General, and that whole health system, which is quite huge, participated in a World Health Forum discussion a couple of weeks ago. Prior to COVID, they were executing about 1% of their patient visits with telehealth. Post-COVID, 85%. It's huge. That's just that the magnitude of that increase is amazing. So the world is starting to change and to adopt because of need, but now hold on to because it works.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
And I sit here as a member of a pharmaceutical company, and I know how we put our toe in the water, and we do things very slowly, as everybody's afraid to change too much too soon in case we do anything to damage the relationships with sites or patients or to affect the data. But this has caused us to look at things very, very differently all at once. And I'll be honest, we haven't got it all right. There are things that we need to work on, and there are things that we need to consider as an implication of going to more telemedicine. But I wonder, Upal, as you think about telemedicine and you think about patient connectivity, and I'll also have this with Dr. Farris as well, I think there's a balance. I think there's a cultural element to it, as well as the different types of diseases. But I would welcome your thoughts on telemedicine and the benefits and that interpersonal connection that a patient or a caregiver needs with a doctor or a study coordinator.
That's actually a very, very good question, Kate. And I always say that telemedicine is not the panacea for all, or for all issues associated with care delivery and clinical research. And I think Kathleen pointed out beautifully that the place of telemedicine in just regular care versus telemedicine in clinical research. I think there are two different elements to that. In general, when you talk to patients and their caregivers, I think they sort of fall into two buckets. I think there's a group of patients and caregivers who love that personal interaction with the infusion nurse, going in and meeting their oncologist regularly. So when they go in for that infusion, they look forward to that in-person interaction and discussing side effects and side effect profiles with their care team. So that group of patients are always going to be very resistant to adopting telemedicine when given a choice. Now, right now it's a compulsion, that's a different thing. But when you have a choice, that group of patients would probably not go in for telemedicine. And then of course, there's another group of patients who are very, very, very technologically savvy, and they're fine adopting telemedicine as a choice. But I think telemedicine also comes with certain structural barriers, which I feel we haven't really figured out completely. I think there is something called the digital divide. I think that's very real. I think you need to have certain resources in place to be able to really do telemedicine through, say, for example, a patient portal. If you want to discuss scans or lab results with your doctor, you need to have access to broadband internet. And let's just face it, living in a city, yes, I take that for granted, but there are lots of patients in America, there are lots of patients in the world who do not have those technologies handy. And I think finally, another issue which we're still sort of grappling with is reimbursement. When patients talk to doctors across different state lines, is that something that's going to be reimbursed or not? So I think, yes, there is a lot of potential to sort of mitigate some of these issues associated with clinical trial conduct, but at the same time, there's some real patient-specific and structural issues that we also need to think about before we sort of go mainstream with telemedicine.
And I completely agree with you. I think there's a human element that we need to focus on. Patients enjoy coming to clinic and seeing patients like themselves. And sometimes because of, especially in oncology, they set up specific times for clinical trials or patient groups, so they develop a community and outreach and support. So I'd be really interested in Dr. Farris now sort of talking about how do you maintain connectivity and that personal element in light of COVID and in light of what we still need those patients to come in.
Yeah, the COVID experience has changed even dramatically. The visit I just did, the face-to-face visits, as well as the telemedicine or the online visits, because our practice went through a similar transformation that was mentioned from Massachusetts General System. We went from really trivial to no telemedicine visits to nearly 80 to 90%. And we've now probably rebalanced that back closer to 50-50, but the telemedicine visits are not going to go away, at least in terms of patient demand. We've had to address also the state line issue, and most of our payers have agreed to, Charlotte happens to be 5 miles from South Carolina, so half of our patients live in South Carolina, and really none of our doctors are specifically or separately licensed there because we don't use hospitals in that state. So we had to, but the payers were pretty quickly agreeable to allow that to cross the state line for reimbursement purposes. So we've been pretty fortunate in that sense in negotiating those arrangements. But certainly going forward, patients are going to not understand why they can't be anywhere in the country or the world and have a visit if that's the way they've done it electronically or digitally previously. So that does obviously need to be addressed. But on the personal connectivity issue, what I initially found as we expanded into telemedicine visits is patients that I already knew well. It seemed to be a pretty smooth transition.
Yeah.
And then generally patients who've had a series of visits due to an ongoing illness, it becomes pretty clear on both parties' parts that after one or two of these visits that we probably should meet face to face. And I don't know if there's a an exact number or an exact, a protocol that should be followed. But it becomes clear, I think, both to the patient and the physician that enough of this this electronic stuff, we probably should get together and see each other face to face. So that what's really unappreciated in a lot of management of healthcare is the personal relationships between physicians and their patients, and how important that is to information transfer between the two parties and to successful health. In fact, when our group 2 years ago was successful in breaking away from a large healthcare system, our tagline was stronger relationships, better health. That's what our whole focus and motto has been. And so so integrating telehealth into that program is part of what we're trying to do, but we're rapidly moving back to encouraging our patients to come to the clinic. Now, we also were proactive in this arena in that at the very outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we rented 2 separate and independent clinic facilities apart from our standing 8 offices. And so that all patients reporting in or calling in for appointments with potential infectious symptoms were routed to separate buildings for their screening tests. And we've become one of the larger screening options here in the Charlotte area. Because of that, we've developed this COVID screening as one of our clinical endeavors for patients beyond our own practice. In other words, other companies and employees that need patients screened, we're providing those services even in other parts of the country. So we got on that. So our buildings, we can pretty much say no patients with COVID-19 have ever been in any of our offices that we know of. So we've been able to reassure patients and therefore encourage even our older patients to come in. You know, I had one elderly couple that likes to come and see me, who I actually had to tell them, you can't just keep coming. It's not reasonable. They come with their gloves and their masks and all the stuff, and they love to come, and it's a big outing for them, and they both come together, and I never know for sure whether it's his appointment or hers because they both talk at the same time. But I did have to say, it's really not safe for y'all. You're 85 years old to be coming back and forth this much. So just we'll do it either by phone or I'll have you in a month. But people love that connection, and it's important. And they'll tell you things because of that connection related to their healthcare and critical to their healthcare that absent that connection, they might just hide it or not mention it. So it's going to be important to make sure that becomes part of our longer term evaluation of our relationship with our patients, that we're not allowing them to escape with just digital only communication.
And I think from my perspective, and coming from being a pharmaceutical company, I think as we learn from this, we have to build our protocols and our understanding of research to be more flexible around an individual patient. Some will want to do, like the couple you mentioned, of course, it's an outing for them. It gives them an outlet as well, and you get to listen to all sorts of things other than their disease, I imagine. Yeah. And that's what they want. Whereas other people are much more comfortable seeing you through the advances of technology. And I think my learning is we have to have a core set of principles. It's how do you balance the two so that patients can make a choice based on their own personal preference and the preference of their physician. And that's not we haven't approached life like that in clinical research before. So that's one of the things I take away. We have actually got some questions from our audience. So are you ready? You're supposed to be nodding now and saying yes. So one of the first questions we were asked was, and I'm going to turn it to Amy for a moment, are clinical trials for patients who have no other options, or are they for patients who are in active treatment, in remission, or seeking a treatment therapy?
I mean, I think the answer is all the above, right? There are patients who, need access to that whole continuum of options. And there are those, I think the general lay public, when they hear clinical trials, they think, oh my gosh, there's nothing left for that patient. This is the Hail Mary approach. And that's just not the case. I mean, we have patients in the cancer arena, and lung cancer specifically, who cover that full spectrum that you described.
And it is exactly that, right? I think sometimes it is seen as the Hail Mary, but for me, and I think the aspiration of many, is it becomes a treatment option in its own right. and then the patient and the doctor and nurses make the decision based on that particular patient's needs and where they are in their disease course. And I would love it to be more of an option rather than thought of as a default for those that have nothing else. There are also some questions around, is there a chance for clinical trials to come safely to people's homes? And I'm going to touch that with Opal right now, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Kate. Thanks for the question. I think if we were having this conversation even 6 months ago, I think my response would be very different. I think, as Kathleen pointed out, and I think also as you pointed out, I think all our pharma partners were sort of dabbling with the concept of decentralized clinical trials, where you can bring the trial to the patient. But everyone was sort of approaching it very cautiously because it was sort of very revolutionary, for lack of better words. And I think the words that we used to hear from sponsors were no decentralization at the cost of protocol deviation. But I think the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of really forced us to think outside the box. It has reminded us that we can be decentralized in certain ways. I'm not saying we can go completely decentralized. I'm not saying that we can take every trial to the patient's home. I think when you have a new molecular entity, when you have a new gene therapy, which requires a lot of monitoring, I think those types of trials, I don't think we are ready to take those to the patient. But then there are certain clinical trials, for example, targeted therapies, phase 3 clinical trials, where we have a lot of safety and efficacy data from a phase 1 clinical trial. I think we are sort of getting ready to take those trials to the patient, where a certain amount of monitoring can happen at local clinics. And, we can ship those drugs to a patient. Instead of just doing 30-day shipments, we can actually ship them for a longer period of time so that the patient does not have to visit the central study site. So I see the COVID-19 pandemic is sort of really making us sort of celebrate protocol deviations and not shy away from them, for lack of better words.
I think I need you to come work with me. Celebrate protocol deviations. They're the bane of my life. Anyway, as we move on to some other questions, it's how have protocols been adapted during COVID-19 to suit the needs of the trial? For example, where patients may be on immunosuppressive treatments or immunomodulated drugs, in the case of psoriasis patients or with cancer patients with other comorbidities, have the treatments been halted? Now, I'm happy to talk about where BMS landed with that, but perhaps it would be good to start again, maybe with Dr. Farris here. What have you seen from maybe a variety of sponsors as you work through many clinical trials at this time?
Yeah, as I mentioned, in the last several months, I've been approved for an initiation of numerous, well, I shouldn't say numerous, probably on the order of 8 to 12 new trials, several of which are in the area of inflammatory bowel disease, where immunosuppressive drugs are critical. And those, essentially all of those trials were held. And so they were for the most part, in my recent experience, those were trials that had not yet really fully initiated. And so one or two of them had begun with a few patients, but they were not really well underway. But I think what I've understood from colleagues and friends is that's been true mostly in the inflammatory bowel disease world, because those patients were singled out as immunosuppressed to begin with. Usually they're on some degree of immunosuppressive therapy, and failing that, prompting them to enter a clinical trial. So even the patients themselves became quite concerned and had to be addressed. That had to be addressed with them specifically. So it really has made a big impact.
Thank you. I think I lost your audio. Can you still hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Okay,
thank you,
all right.
sir. And I think every company looked at things differently as COVID emerged, and based on their portfolio or the types of drugs that they had in development, made sort of a risk versus benefit of continuation of trials that were ongoing, or starting new studies. BMS's position was to do everything we could to continue with the ongoing trials, making sure that patients were safe, healthcare providers were safe, and that our own staff that visit sites to do the monitoring of the data were safe, but that we paused any new clinical trials. And the reason we took that approach was predominantly because as a clinical trial starts, we felt there needed to be much more interaction and support to those sites and those staff as they began to move forward with a new entity or a new trial. And we couldn't provide that if we couldn't get into the sites. And many of the sites, unfortunately, were in a situation where they couldn't allow us access. That continues today, and we're monitoring it on an ongoing basis weekly at a site level. The only trials we stopped were in cellular therapy, and that is really because of the needs of those particular patients and the potential for them to be significantly immunosuppressed, but also because there is a potential for those patients to need an intensive care bed. And we as a company took the decision that those intensive care beds needed to be used for the wider good of the community. And while that was a horrible decision to make and not an easy decision to make, because obviously cellular therapy offers an option of hope and treatment, we felt as a company that the healthcare providers in those facilities needed to focus on what was going on around them at that time. We've subsequently come around, and as sites are ready, we're releasing and starting studies again. But that's where we took it as a company. And I don't think we were wholly different from industry. Anyway, I think I'm now losing control over the questions that are coming in. I'd just like to say that. So thank you very much. I am going to have to scroll for a minute to find the next one. There are so many and so many positive comments from you all. One of the questions to all of the panelists, and maybe I'll start with Kathleen, as I haven't been there for a while. What are you seeing, and what is your company doing to listen to advocacy groups that support clinical trial design, especially when we think about COVID? So I'll start with Kathleen, and then maybe Amy would take that one as it pertains to one being the receiving end of that information, and one I'm sure that you are actively seeking information from your community in order to provide that type of information.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment, and probably Amy can do a lot more. Our organization has a large group that focuses on advocacy relationships, but we also know we always need to do more, and that there is more opportunity. And frankly, one of the things my participation in this panel has spurred is further discussion with Dave and Grit Health about how we can participate more fully in panels like this, in discussions with advocacy groups. Can we change the way those are initiated and enhance the level of discussion so that we are listening to more? I think we work with several groups that are advocacy and online community groups trying to listen to patients. We also have a very strong focus on investigators and sites and listening to them and what they're hearing from their patients. And it's something that everybody needs to do a better job of all of the time. And sometimes it works very well, and sometimes it's challenging. You know, certain disease areas and indications, the advocacy groups are much stronger, and there's more of them that you can interact with, right? So I think it's something that the industry does in a very uneven way, right? And that we need to learn from this pandemic again, and the things that we have kicked off. And again, just like with technologies and different types of interactions with patients, we need to think about the role that advocacy groups play in that as well, and the roles that investigators play in that, and how we better connect all those dots.
So I think that's a perfect segue to go to Amy to talk about advocacy in the community.
Well, I think, you know, the lung cancer space is blessed with a number of advocacy groups who are, you know, trying to educate and empower our community. And COVID has really necessitated us coming together in ways that we have not done as well historically. And Upal and I, and our colleague Janet Freeman Daly, a patient advocate with the Ross Wonders, have really led the charge on collaborating to provide weekly updates to the lung cancer community because of the reasons we discussed before, because of the heightened risk for these patients. And so as scientists, we feel a certain obligation to source vetted material. It's overwhelming for those of us who are scientists to keep pace with all the information that's coming out, and it changes so frequently. So we want to take that on ourselves and provide a unified voice to our community so that they can be informed and empowered to take those necessary steps and precautions to protect themselves. Yet at the same time, we are, wanting to hear that input and feedback from them. We learn as much from our patients as hopefully they learn from us. And, we have been really trying to keep our finger on the pulse of the concerns in the lung cancer community so that we can be as proactive as possible in providing updates that address those concerns, that make them feel, that they have a sense of control in what seems to be a very out of control world right now, and, it's just been such an honor to work together with Upal and be part of that. And I think it's needed, and I think it's been greatly valued and appreciated by our community.
And that's a fantastic segue, actually, because I have a question that's come through. And I think for Dr. Farris and Upal, I'd like you to sort of consider the answering this one. It's specifically asked, so panelists, more specifically on the patient perspective of trials, as we re-emerge from COVID, many patients might feel conflicted, right? Fear of exposure, which we've touched on, fear of or being unemployed right now, right? Having therefore a lack of insurance. And is that leading people to choose clinical trials more readily than you've seen in the past? I'd be interested, but from Dr. Farris's perspective, if he's seeing that, or if Upal, you're hearing about that through the network and the patients that you interact with. Dr. Farris.
Yes, that's an interesting thing that has in fact come up. Patients that have been laid off or lost their jobs and therefore lost their insurance have inquired as to whether or not clinical trials would be possibilities. It's hard to accommodate patients in that circumstance. Sometimes the trial will fit for that, and sometimes the patient has to have gone through a series of other medications or reached a certain process that would typically be done under an insurance support program to reach eligibility for clinical trials. So, but it has come up certainly through patient inquiries several occasions to do that. And in terms of patients' concerns about exposure and so forth, I am, we are working toward redesign of trial options where home visits or home monitoring does become a bigger option for patients with those concerns. And certainly we're all aware of the technologies that anything from heart rates to oxygen saturations and even EKGs and so forth, blood pressures can all be measured by the patients themselves at home and even electronically transmitted immediately to whichever platform we would want to set it up for. So some of that can be designed into the trial with a patient-centered approach so that the patient's concerns can be alleviated that way. And as you mentioned earlier on, in some cases there may be an option to design a trial with choice for the patient. So maybe you'll ask that a certain percentage of the visits be in the clinic, but that other ones can be conducted by the patient at home and data submitted that way. So I think trial design with patient-centeredness is going to be very helpful to mitigate patient concerns that way and make them feel comfortable.
And moving from there to Upal, how do you think that, have you heard anything around lack of insurance and therefore uptake of clinical trial interest?
I'll actually start with Dr. Farris's second point about patient-centeredness in clinical trials. And for those patients who are already on clinical trials right now, that was a huge concern for them. Can I go back, especially those patients who are on infusion-related treatments? That was a huge concern. Can I go back or should I defer treatment? And when we've had recent discussions with clinicians, with oncologists, we've been told very clearly that clinics are taking a lot of precautions. There's a lot of cleaning in between. So when you see a patient, then there's a lot of cleaning going on between two patients, and then the infusion rooms are being disinfected very regularly. So doctors are taking all sorts of precautions to keep patients safe. And this is even the case of scanning and other types of monitoring that, if you're going to the clinical trial site, people, we tell patients, what, you are being taken care of. Doctors are making sure that, you're not being exposed to the virus. And as also Dr. Farris pointed out, a lot of trials are also considering options of local monitoring, where a patient can have a blood draw at their local clinic or have a scan at their local clinic. So this is what we tell patients, that, what, the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of reminded the entire clinical trial ecosystem, and that's just not your local doctor. That's your doctor, that's your clinical trial team, that's industry partners, that's regulators such as the FDA. Everyone has actually come together to sort of reimagine this system, because at the end of the day, they want to make you feel safe. They don't want to jeopardize your safety. So you've got this whole group, this whole system working together to make sure that you're kept safe. So that's what we tell patients when they ask us about, exposure. Now, the first question about uptake of clinical trials due to lack of health insurance, I think that's a very, very nuanced issue, and we have got those questions. But the reality, as Dr. Farris also pointed out, is it's very, very trial specific. I think a lot of trials will cover costs associated with treatment, but a lot of trials do not. So, and this is something we encourage patients to do, is to have candid conversations with the healthcare providers, because I think it's very difficult to say that all trials will accommodate you without health insurance. And I think that's misleading. So I think it's a very, very nuanced situation, and that's what we tell our patients, to have those types of candid discussions with their healthcare provider.
That's very, very sound advice, and it is actually a reflection of reality. I'm going to move to a completely different question, but it's come up several times, and it's quite an interesting one. It says, so as you look at cellular therapy, which is known to create cytokine release syndrome in patients, or can as a side effect, is anybody looking at lessons learned from cellular therapy in relation to cytokine release syndrome, which is a manifestation of COVID? So I don't know who wants to answer that question, but I'm looking at Upal, and he's getting very, very excited right now. So
actually, I was going to deflect that to Amy. She's the virologist in the group.
I confess that was my question. And, I think, that's one key and important takeaway, and I don't know the answer. I do think that, what I hope to convey to people is, I feel like there's this sense among many that there's an either or choice that we're facing right now. It's COVID or it's clinical trials or research, and that, one is happening at the expense of the other. And I think the point here is that there are learnings from COVID that can inform our understanding of things going on in the cancer space and vice versa. As a virologist who then moved into cancer research, I know the interconnectivity of these two fields. And I think that despite, kind of an appropriate focus on COVID in the short term, that what we're learning daily can help us, going forward. And I think we talk about silver linings. I know we're going to get to that later, but, like the lung cancer community in particular, they're like, oh my gosh, everybody's focused on COVID and nothing's happening for lung cancer right now. Well, the reality is it's a respiratory virus. So a lot of people are looking closely at the lungs right now, and we're going to learn things from there that help us understand more. But, yes, that's a question. I don't know. There might be answers. It may be too early to really know in the case of cytokine release in the context of COVID versus, cellular therapy. But it is a curious kind of down the road question that I would be interested from a scientific standpoint and understanding.
Oh, it's not a down the road question, I think. I mean, I know that probably the audience and many people are focused on vaccine trials for COVID-19, but there's also an awful lot of trials going on looking at established compounds and medicines that deal with the immunoreactivity of the human body. And if we could dampen that down, would we dampen down the significant response that is seen in certain patients in response to having COVID-19? So there is that dichotomy. It's not just about a saving vaccine for COVID-19, it's leveraging therapies we already have and seeing whether they will in any way inhibit the disease getting worse for those particular patients. And I think you're right, we will learn more. It will be applicable in other therapeutic areas, but just as everything, it takes time, and it takes the willingness of a clinical trial participant to begin to even step forth on that journey. I'm going to switch topics now completely. And one of the questions that has come up several times in the chat as I'm looking about it is, do you think, and let's start with Kathleen because I haven't been to her for a while, do you think that clinical trials will adjust the participant numbers and requirements because of COVID?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure that they will adjust because of COVID, but I think they will adjust because of the new ways and opportunities in which we're capturing that data. And also because we have access to more and more previously collected data and data from things like electronic health records in an anonymized fashion, but that will allow us to do some of the research using the data only without actually interfering directly with the patient. So while COVID again may help impel adoption of some of these new methods, it's not really because of COVID as a disease that these changes will happen. And those of you in the oncology world know we are already starting to see things like synthetic control arms being executed with the data. The regulatory agencies are beginning to accept those, and the data science required to actually do that technical data analytics piece is enhancing all the time, as is the application of AI technologies.
Absolutely. And from my own perspective, while it doesn't change the number of participants in our ongoing trials and our upcoming trials, what we are doing is taking a very hard look at what we're asking patients to do as part of those clinical trials and trying to streamline and simplify them. Not only is that better because that's the right thing to do, but also we're acutely aware that particularly on oncology and some of the diseases we work in, they are incredibly complex studies, and sites don't need complexity right now. What they need is simplicity. We've seen we as a company, and I'm sure you have as well, seen a significant drop-off in patient recruitment over the last 3 months. We're down to 16% of our plan, and that's detrimental to the drug development continuum. It's detrimental to making these medicines available to patients and getting through approval. And so our goal is to simplify everything that we can in order to help sites and help patients rebound on the development continuum. And that's why we're taking such action that we are. And I'm sure we're not alone. I really am.
No, yeah, I would agree. We're seeing that as well. I also think that, and this has been something that's been happening for years as well, slowly, and I know Amy and Upal can comment, is what data are we collecting that's important to the scientists versus what data are we collecting that's important to the patient? Are we adequately considering the quality of life metrics, the ability to live a day-to-day good life versus just those scientific endpoints that a scientist somewhere is interested in, but is it truly essential to the approval of that drug? So I think,
smiling.
Right, this situation is going to probably increase that debate somewhat as well.
And I always, when the protocols are being developed, if I'm ever asked my opinion, I always say, well, would you put your mum into it?
To it. So,
And if you would answer that to no, because it's too complicated, then really, what are you asking people to do? So I use the mum barometer to try and get my development teams to think about the reality of what they're asking. It doesn't always work, but at least, you know, I have the practical sense of it all.
Yeah, just to bolt on to that quickly, you know, from the patient perspective, and Upal and I, you know, kind of are deeply involved in this and interfacing with, there are a number of online patient groups in the lung cancer community, and, you know, they have a seat at the table, and I think they have been paramount in really a sea change in the lung cancer community, and that has, you know, we're seeing the fruits of that investment, I think, but there's more to do, right? But I think now we're banding together, and much of our work is how do we continue to bring patients to the forefront of these conversations. And we talk about disrupting the paradigm and patient-powered research. And, you know, it's so important. And so that is always, as scientists, you know, we kind of wear both hats. We want to, you know, advance science, but we want to do it in the service of the patients that we're here, you know,
To serve.
here for. Yeah.
And to serve. And I have a question that I think is quite impactful. As we are in a situation where we've seen development sort of drop off because of the situation of COVID, we always struggle with ensuring patients have awareness of clinical trials anyway, and that they have the reality of clinical trials rather than sometimes the perception of clinical trials. I wonder, Dr. Farris, and perhaps then Upal, you could perhaps comment on how can we increase awareness? How do we increase knowledge of clinical trials, especially in certain communities around the globe? So I welcome your input, Dr. Farris.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It's a difficult issue to, particularly if you want to think worldwide, to bring clinical trial information, you know, into other communities that are not used to receiving it. A lot of what we've talked about today, with, as Upal mentioned earlier, with respect to digital technology, is available in our urban areas and in certain societies, but there are certainly many areas of our own country and certainly worldwide where there just simply isn't the broadband access and internet access that would be required for all the various things that we take for granted. So I don't have any real good solution for that besides just the kind of the standard outreach programs that people have used to do that. Now in our own community, we've been able, you know, we have a big social media platform, and we're able to use that to bring our own clinical trial information to everyone in the community. It's certain, I think that's been a very powerful mechanism for us, but again, that's not available worldwide, certainly, although increasingly it is, but that project is ongoing. So thank you for the question.
And Upal, what about your perspective on raising awareness and sort of overcoming misperception?
I think I'll echo Dr. Farris's answer in that it's a really difficult question to answer at this point, whether, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity to increase awareness about clinical trials in general. But one thing that does come to mind in terms of reaching under, you know, different racial and ethnic minority communities, which, you know, traditionally I think in general, the research system has struggled a lot and really not made a lot of effort to be very inclusive, let's be honest. But I think one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic, and opportunity for lack of better words, is I think the role of the primary care physician and the role of federally qualified healthcare centers in managing and playing a role in the COVID-19 pandemic has just become stronger. And I think we underestimate the involvement, or I would say the influence, that a primary care physician may have in sort of getting a patient to first think of a clinical trial. And we know that when we are talking about what's the biggest influencer of whether a patient decides to go on to a clinical trial or not, it's the doctor. It's not the patient advocacy group who convinces the patient to go on a clinical trial. It's not their friends and family. It's actually the doctor who has the highest influence. And I think a group of doctors who've been sort of brought into the limelight because of the COVID-19 pandemic are primary care physicians. And I think that is definitely an opportunity that we should tap onto.
And I would say I love doctors. However, I think the study nurse has a major component in developing the relationship and helping people understand the practicality of being in a clinical trial. So I'm a bigger advocate as the study coordinator needs to be my friend every step of the way. Not that
Very
I don't
much
know
so.
a doctor. I'm looking at the panelists, and I'm going to ask a question for all four of you at the moment to consider. As we think about the re-emergence into clinical trials and how we're all trying to do that upswing again and raise awareness, open trials, reach patients, what do you think has been the greatest positive or negative of this pandemic from a clinical trial patient perspective? So maybe we have two positives, and maybe if you can think of two negatives as well. And you're all smiling, so I'm going to go to Upal first because he's smiling at me the most.
I think one of the biggest positives, Kate, that comes up, that just pops up instantly is the fierce collaborative efforts that I think the whole world has taken in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, at the remarkable speed at which the clinical trial ecosystem has come together. Doctors, nurses, patients, physicians, industry partners, regulators. This was just kind of, I have not seen something of this magnitude in the past. And it's sad to say that we needed a pandemic to force this kind of collaboration. But you know what, be as it may, I think this is I think one of the biggest positives that for me is apparent. I think the second positive that has emerged from the pandemic is for us to sort of reimagine clinical trial design, which I think we were all scared of doing. And I think we were all, I think all our industry colleagues, all our pharma sponsors, they were dabbling with new ideas. Let's use the word dabble.
Evolution takes a long time.
But in this case, I'll say necessity is the mother of invention. And I think we have reimagined clinical trial conduct right from, excessive monitoring. Can we revisit excessive monitoring? Can we do local monitoring? To what Kathleen brought up, the use of real world control. We've heard a lot of those discussions in the past, but I think now is the time when we can actually see some of them being operationalized. I think those are, two of the biggest silver linings. And if you ask me about something negative, I would say I'm an eternal optimist, so it's very rare for me to see something in a negative light. I'm going to actually quote Amy here and say, maybe in the beginning of the pandemic, I was a little taken aback by maybe the delay that research was probably going to go through. But as Amy also pointed out, that that delay actually has become this wonderful opportunity to learn more about the lung, to learn more about different aspects of lung biology. So again, it's hard for me to say that something is negative.
Go on, Amy. I know that you want to jump in now.
Well, I was going to say, I think he said everything I wanted to say, but it's been a weird time and a crazy kind of perspective and convergence of my previous life as a virologist and now being a lung cancer advocate. I mean, I agree with all the silver linings that Upal indicated. I think there was a deep fear initially that on the part of lung cancer patients that they were just immediately counted out, that they wouldn't have access to treatment if they got sick, the clinical trials were stopping, and it, for a community that is so reliant on research, that was devastating. And I think a key takeaway is, we've seen a flurry of recent FDA approvals and a lot of positive momentum in the lung cancer community. And, we were part of a conversation. I know. I mean, it's just, I can't keep pace. Like, it's just too many. Let's slow down. No, that's wonderful. And it's an affirmation that our work has not stopped in the face of this pandemic. I would say, from a perspective of building research infrastructure, we know the impacts financially that the pandemic is having. And my kind of deep fear is funding and ongoing funding for research and for lung cancer research. We know we're still deeply underfunded for the lung cancer community and for the prevalence of lung cancer. We need to do better. So what does all this mean for that going forward? And we have to continue to advocate, and that's where patients have to continue to make their voices heard and show that their lives count on us continuing to make progress. And we can't slow down, we can't halt, we have to dig in harder and deeper and faster. To, at the beginning of the year, we were celebrating the biggest single year drop in cancer mortality, and much of that was attributed to advancements in immunotherapy and targeted therapies, which have been shown in lung cancer in particular to be phenomenal agents of, extending, improving, saving lives. So we have work to do, but I'm very, Upal and I are optimists by heart, and so I'm very hopeful and encouraged. But we still have to, my biggest concern is complacency, honestly, of people, and that they're getting, a little bit too relaxed, and they're normalizing the situation. This pandemic is still ongoing, and the fear is that people are going to get too lax and put themselves at risk. So that's, yeah.
Absolutely. And then Kathleen, positives coming out of this as we try to reform and move forward with our clinical research? You have to come off mute. Kathleen?
Yeah, sorry, my audio cut out there a little bit. It's been a little spotty. So, Amy and Upal have said everything that I would have said too. I think the positive is this is an opportunity, and we all need to seize that opportunity. And the negative is the potential complacency. Amy, I agree with you, not just in the general population, but in pharma. Are we going to let our traditional ways and fear of something new and different prevent us from making the true changes to the way drugs are developed that we have the opportunity to do now? And it's not an opportunity. COVID has put it in front of our face, but the technology, the data, the patient awareness, the science has all moved so far in the last few years. The regulatory agencies are right there also. How do we harness that and really engender true change in the way we do things?
I think that's up to everybody on this call.
Exactly.
To not let us slide backwards, to learn. Like I said, we've not got it perfect. We never will. Magic isn't perfect. But what we have done is made huge strides in a very short period of time. And it's on the shoulders of all of us not to let us slide backwards. It's very easy to say, well, we did that because of COVID. No, we have leveraged COVID to improve what we want to do. I wonder if Dr. Farris has a perspective for us right now.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly agree with what's been said, and would pick up on a couple of things. The focus from a patient perspective on the importance of having a strong primary care physician, internal medicine physician, as the real anchor of their healthcare is very helpful for us in clinical research, because as Upal was alluding to, in our practice, which is a multi-specialty group of our 100 and something doctors, 60 some of them are primary care physicians, and those are the physicians that set the attitude of the patient as to whether they're open to clinical trial experience or not. And when those physicians say that, I'd like you to see Dr. Farris or someone else in our group and consider a trial for your situation, that's really all that needs to happen for the patient to be completely open to getting with a study coordinator and getting involved on the nuts and bolts of what it would be like. But that open-mindedness that's provided through that relationship with the primary care doctor is, I think, what leads to a successful outcome in terms of patient enrollment and then ultimately patient care. I think COVID has helped refocus everybody, but particularly patients, on the importance of that relationship. And then the other silver lining that we've lived through, and I guess as everyone continues to say in various forums that is not going away is the use of telemedicine and the comfort that patients are getting with it, and then our ability to adapt that into clinical trial redesign and a patient-centered approach to clinical trials. As the patients become increasingly comfortable with seeing their routine healthcare through that mechanism, I think they'll be equally open to and desirous of doing clinical trial research that way, and there'll be a certain comfort that they have with it that I think may make clinical trial work easier going forward. So that's what I see as important silver linings.
And for me, I think we touched on it briefly, it's the collaboration that we're seeing, even pharmaceutical companies coming together to share their placebo data on COVID-19 trials through Transcelerate, and equally importantly is, while the pharmaceutical industry has been hesitant to move forward, we're often in discussion with the regulatory agencies and the health authorities around the globe about what they need to see or what they require us to do. And there has been an extreme openness from each regulatory authority, each country around the world, to really look at what are they requiring and how can they perhaps provide us guidance on how to be more flexible. I know we had a discussion just this morning in oncology with the FDA, listening to their perspectives around patient care and the continuation of clinical trials as this pandemic continues to be an awful lot longer than anybody predicted it would be. And I think that gives me the sense that we won't move backwards, that there is an openness and an awareness that while we've had a fantastic ability to run clinical trials in one paradigm, that the door is opening to other avenues for us to leverage real world evidence data, to leverage telemedicine data, to be more flexible on e-consent and how to support a patient through their journey of clinical research is really coming to the fore. So from my perspective, that it is about flexibility and collaboration, and it doesn't matter who pays your salary or what part of drug development you're involved in, seeing those barriers come down as we all move towards a new paradigm for us all. And I can only believe that this is going to benefit our patients immensely, not just from less for them to do, not just from less visits to a hospital, but also the timeline potentially to move from a first in human through to an approval may be reshaped. And that gives me my silver lining out of what is truly a horrific point in our history, I think, from my perspective. I don't know. As we move forward, and I'm looking on the chat, as I have to, as the moderator, to see what other questions or concerns that the group has, or the questions. I will tell you all that many of the commentary coming through is very supportive of the position that you've taken and the highlights that you've given the group today. And truly, having seen this going on, I am absolutely privileged to be able to moderate this very, very dynamic conversation. As we head to the close of the hour or the hour and a half that we've had, I've had the opportunity to ask you all lots of questions, some from our audience, our virtual audience, and some that I've come up with myself. I wonder if you have a question for me. I'm going to put myself on the hot spot now.
I just put one in the chat that I think we all have to think about going forward, and that is, as hopefully vaccines come online for clinical trials, you know, how do we begin to position the communities we represent to have access to those trials, knowing that, you know, lung cancer patients are at heightened risk and other rare diseases might be at heightened risk for poor outcomes. How do we ensure access to vaccines? And that's something that I think the advocacy groups will have to have a presence and a voice in that dialogue.
And you raise a very, very good point, actually. It's not just about vaccines, it's about all treatments available to patients in need. And the one thing I would say, working for the company I do, we have a health equity initiative as well as a diversity and awareness initiative for clinical trials. And we've actually brought the two together. So that it's not, so taking it at a holistic umbrella look and then leveraging each side of that to enhance what we do, how we do it, specifically reaching out to patient advocates to understand what they want from research as well as what they need from a company like ours. And so I am hopeful. So even within my own company, I'm seeing sort of organizational structure is a wonderful thing, but it's also a divider of knowledge sometimes and a divider of expertise. And I'm seeing that come down in my own organization, which is truly, truly great for the patients that we serve. So I'm glad about that question. Thank you. I don't know, Kathleen, have you got one for me?
I think I'm unmuted now. Sorry. Ben's been muting me because I've been slow, so then we both had to do it.
I wish I could do that with my kids sometimes.
Yeah, my dogs. So I mean, how positive are you? I get the sense you're an optimist also, but how positive are you that both your own company and the industry will take advantage of this and move it forward? You know, that's where I you know, on the down moments, I get really concerned that we're not going to do it.
So looking at the way we've adapted, we've written new interim procedures that allow for flexibility in drugs going to patient home where it's safe to do that and where they can administer it safely themselves. Telemedicine, going wherever the patient can to get their images in oncology studies, going to whatever blood draws they need, or just having discussions via the phone. All of that, we've even set up different procedures for how we look at the data, because we're going to have data gaps. And how do we still close our trials and lock that data down for submissions? All of those things have led us to look differently. And my position is we did that as a result of COVID, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it moving forward. And how do you take that interim procedure and embed it into your organization? And that is the goal that I have for my organization, and certainly as I speak with others, is to ensure that you don't lose it. It would be a crime to the situation we find ourselves in if you just let it slide back to normal. And I'm encouraged that I think the health authorities don't want us to slide back either. And if they can continue to provide the pressure of their requirements and their flexibility, then that gives us even more impetus to keep going along the journey we're going on. At the end of the day, our job is to make it as easy and available to join a clinical trial as is humanly possible. And that's the mantra that we should all have, irrespective of COVID, I think.
Couldn't agree more.
You let me off easy.
I did, sorry.
That's all right.
It's the end of that time.
I know that we are heading towards the end of our time together, and I really thought maybe we should hand it back to Grit and to wrap us up. And hopefully, I really believe that the panelists have been incredibly insightful today, have been courageous to answer this fleeting set of questions that have come in offhand from all of you without being prepared. It does take a moment. As I said, I was nervous and excited to do this. So I really would like to thank all of the panelists and the audience for being with us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it back.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kathleen, Amy, Upal, Christopher. Boy, we started out the session today talking about wanting to be present and not perfect. And I was just humbled listening to not trying to have perfect answers, but how much everybody's leaning into the questions. And that's a scary thing. Drug development and clinical trials are complex, and there are more questions than answers. I know for me personally, I became involved in this space after a personal experience and not knowing how to navigate. And that was 8 years ago for me that I was personally affected. And I can't tell you that after 8 years in this field, I know all the answers, but I know that questions are what matter. And the openness, and Upal, I heard you say fierce collaborations. And I agree completely. Tearing down walls and making them bridges is what will move us through this period. And so I'm going to have a demo. I have just a couple of comments to wrap up. I also want to thank Kate for moderating and everything you're doing with Bristol Myers Squibb and supporting this advocacy exchange and these conversations. The ability to come together and tackle these problems is life-changing at a time that I know we need it and we all need it. So thank you so much to you and BMS. And for our panelists, I couldn't imagine a more human gathering. And when I think about the expertise that you all bring and the careers you've dedicated to this field, to just hear the humanity come through in your comments is really humbling. So please accept our deep gratitude. This is a conversation, not a panel, so this will continue, and we hope to see you and everyone in the COVID Advocacy Exchange much more going forward. And I'd like to address our attendees. You're with us because you care deeply, or because you've been affected personally, or something personal. And I'd like you, as we move towards wrapping up, to share any final thoughts. What have you taken from this, or how have you been affected, or what questions do you have? We have done so much listening and learning just over these last couple months, and it's really humbling to have so many conversations. If I've gotten to speak with you, thank you. If I haven't, please send me an email. I'll ask my team to put my personal email in the chat bar. Please, anyone send me an email, and we'll make sure we have a conversation and include you in the advocacy exchange. Yeah. And I've said this before, anytime I struggle to form thoughts, I always go back to purpose. This year, just before COVID really impacted us, we had the honor of being part of an event at SCOPE, which is the Summit for Clinical Operations Executives. And it is a really wonderful gathering of people in clinical development that are really trying to move healthcare forward. And every year they have a participant engagement and a patient centricity award. And Kate, I know BMS was recognized last year for your work in patient centricity. GRIT had the honor of being recognized this year for our work in patient centricity. And to be a part of that is deeply humbling. I remember one of the comments, Kelly McKee, who's been in this for a long time as well, she asked a room full of clinical development professionals and clinical executives, who is a fan of research? And I think her, I see hands going up immediately. I love it. I love it. Kelly's question, I think, sometimes the most simple articulations are the most profound. And we all do this because we care so much about saving lives and improving lives. And the one common thread, the one through thread to me in every one of these conversations has been how much every one of us deeply care about those missions. Helping people live longer and live better lives is what this conversation is all about. And so it's for that reason we're so grateful to spend this time together. I do want to, I know several of the people have asked for a tour of the virtual conference. And so I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to ask that Ben, if I mess anything up, who's on our team, and make sure everything works right. If I've messed anything up, please let me know. And so this is where we've been gathering in this auditorium inside the COVID Advocacy Exchange for the last hour and a half. And this is open now 24/7 anywhere around the world. And as we've set this up inside the auditorium, each of these sessions, this is the one you're actually watching right now, this will be available as a recorded version in the next couple of days. So please come back and watch it. Let your friends know, invite your communities. We're opening this up to everybody to engage and be a part of it. And then all of the sessions going back to May 28th about collaborations and virtual conferences, launching this on the 21st. These are all here and available 24/7. So we're proud to share them with you. And then in the exhibitor area here, all of these booths are interactive. You can click on all of the resources to navigate around, learn more about the Advocacy Exchange, see what resources are available for you. And we're just really proud to co-create this with everyone. This is truly a collaborative effort. And Upal, I thought your fierce collaborations, that's going to be with me for a while. So thank you very much. As I draw this to a close, this whole advocacy experience is an opportunity to listen. And I thought our panelists and our moderator today did such a wonderful job listening to questions. We encourage everybody to continue sharing them. We have several more weeks, many more weeks ahead of us. Next week is focused on telemedicine. And I see Patty and several others here at the end have made comments about diversity and inclusion. And these are topics that we will tackle not only in our speakers, but in the content of these sessions. And so as we dig into those, we want to hear specifically the issues you want to talk about and focus on and create solutions together for. So I will draw it to a close. There is so much more I want to say, and I hope you will come back to be a part of that conversation going forward. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Bristol Myers Squibb, my team with Grit Health, Evoke Kind for building awareness, letting people know, and you for being a part of this. Have a wonderful day and much more to come.